I'm Liz Neisloss. Tonight on Greater Boston, there's been a spike in hate crimes in Massachusetts, according to a new report from the Anti-Defamation League's Center for Extremism. The center's vice president joins me on how the ADL is addressing the growing problem and why they believe this is only going to get worse. Then, a look at the life of music legend Tina Turner, from her iconic career to her public discussions about surviving domestic violence. Hate is on the rise here in Massachusetts, according to a new report from the Anti-Defamation League, which found a 33% spike in hate crimes in this state, according to the latest FBI data. The ADL also reported a spike in anti-Semitic incidents, distribution of white supremacist propaganda, and extremism targeting the LGBTQIA community. It's an alarming trend we've seen nationwide, but the organization says Massachusetts is one of the worst states, and the problem here is only growing. Joining me to discuss are Oren Segal, Vice President of the ADL Center for Extremism. Oren, what is it about the state of Massachusetts?
So what's happening in Massachusetts is not unique to Massachusetts. We're seeing a rise in hate crimes, anti-Semitic incidents, crimes against other communities across the nation. And frankly, it shows that I think people's preconceived notions of where this type of hate may be in the country are probably often wrong. In a state like Massachusetts, which has a large population, of course, we are seeing the types of activity that perhaps some people think wouldn't happen in that part of the country or that is somebody else's problem. So Massachusetts is representative of, frankly, what we're seeing across the country.
I've seen some speculation that there's something about the history, the colonial history of Massachusetts that draws fanatics. Is there any truth to that?
I mean, extremists will never miss an opportunity to leverage either a crisis or some, historical background to glom onto in order to attract or to try to attract people to their cause. So, Massachusetts being a place where, there was a Tea Party and revolution, I mean, it's going to be naturally attractive to those who want to create their own revolution today. But frankly, it's about extremists finding sort of local issues to try to exploit. And again, that's happening throughout the country.
So let's look at some of the numbers from your report, and then maybe you can break some of this down for us. From 2021 to 2022, anti-Semitic incidents up 41%. White supremacist propaganda up 71%. And then you also found Massachusetts is a hotbed for anti-LGBTQ plus extremism, which increased nationwide in 2022. So, Oren, help us understand the anti-Semitic incidents. How are they manifesting themselves?
Yeah, so what we do at ADL is report and document a wide variety of anti-Semitic incidents that are reported to us by communities. So this can be in the form of harassment or vandalism at an institution. It also includes assaults. And this 41% increase is quite a stark number. Nationwide, we saw a 36% increase year over year. And all told, the highest record of anti-Semitic incidents ever reported to ADL in the 40 plus years of doing this. Part of this, I think, we believe, is because of the broader normalization of anti-Semitism and hate, right? What happens on our social media feeds, in our public discussion, often animates what we're seeing on the ground. And I think it's no surprise that we're seeing this increase in anti-Semitic incidents in Massachusetts and elsewhere at the same time that we have influencers who are using their platforms to promote that sort of hatred. So when anti-Semitism is a political football, really the people who are becoming those who are victimized are those who are on the ground in these communities.
So just before we began taping here, there was an announcement out of the Biden-Harris administration talking about what they call the first national strategy to combat anti-Semitism. And one of the pillars of that strategy is apparently to address that normalization, to have the NBA get involved, the recording industry get involved. What can you tell us about this strategy?
Right. So the mere fact that there is this first comprehensive national strategy on anti-Semitism is a reminder that there's a problem with anti-Semitism in this country that would make that even be needed. It's really, really important because not only is it the first of its kind, but it has very specific details about how government ought to tackle this issue in terms of focusing on security for Jewish institutions, but also saying that this requires a whole of society approach, that people who are influencers, who are, normalizing what we talk about every single day, that are basically influential people, have a role to play in combating anti-Semitism. And it lays out a pretty significant plan. I should also note, ADL was involved in helping promote some of the strategies that we have that we work on every day. But knowing that, government is speaking out, using their position of influence to call this out and then provide solutions is just an incredibly important step.
One of the pieces of this, though, really is, as you say, the role of social media, the role of the companies that are behind social media. Earlier this week, the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, talked about the detrimental influence, issuing a stark warning about social media and calling on more attention to be paid to the companies behind all this. So this is really a big piece of the puzzle when it comes to tackling hate. What do you think the responsibility should be of social media companies?
Yeah, it's just not unreasonable anymore for users of social media to expect that these companies put people over their profits, to make it more difficult for anti-Semitic harassment and ideas and narratives to spread around the world with the greatest of ease. And so what we have been calling for, and what I think this national strategy reinforces, is some accountability for those who enable anti-Semitism to reach the widest possible audiences. That means those companies that are making money hand over fist invest some of that in identifying anti-Semitism and other forms of hate and making their platforms a place where it's harder and difficult to actually spread those messages. Again, that seems logical, but it has seemed very difficult for these companies to do, and it's not unreasonable.
So you have found in your own research a lack of transparency from these companies that claim they are committing to tackle these issues. So can you describe the issues, the problems that you found?
Yeah, part of it is that not only is it lack of transparency, that a lot of companies don't even provide the data to assess, have outside folks assess the levels of anti-Semitism. But frankly, it's the algorithms that they build that actually bring people deeper into these hateful ideas, right? They are focused on engagement. And if anti-Semitism and other forms of hate are selling, they're going to basically curate that and provide that to folks. And we're saying that doesn't have to be. So one of the ways that we have tried to combat that is we know how extremists and anti-Semites and bigots speak. We know the tattoos that they use, the code words that they use, the memes that they deploy. And we provide that to companies to train their algorithms to identify that so that they could proactively remove it. But that requires a company wanting to create a safer space online. And sometimes that's the challenge.
And you also talk about the need for better reporting to be able to account for all the hate crimes. Is there really an undercount?
Yeah, so, nationwide, there's 80 plus cities that report zero hate crimes or don't report at all. Massachusetts does report hate crimes, and we saw a 33% increase there. But I think overall, data drives policy. In order to solve a problem, you need to get an understanding of what that is. And that's why reporting hate crimes is so important. That's why reporting anti-Semitic incidents to ADL and to law enforcement is important. That's why when the LGBTQ community is under attack and in the crosshairs by extremists, we need reporting there as well, because that will then help move the needle to find solutions from policymakers and others.
But for the LGBTQ plus community within the state of Massachusetts, isn't there more that can be done by the state to protect them?
Yeah, listen, there are mechanisms that are set up by government, by non-governmental organizations for reporting. People need to do that. I think another thing that is critically important is that people in positions of power, not only in government, but influencers, as we described, speak out against the conspiracies that are running rampant against the LGBTQ community. It's not just that you have Nazis marching, in the middle of Boston who promote these hateful ideas. It's sometimes we're seeing others who have more influence or are not card-carrying members of any extremist group who are promoting these same narratives. And all that does is empower those who have a history of violence.
So just before we began taping again, Stuart Rhodes, the founder of the Oath Keepers, the far-right militia, he was sentenced to 18 years in prison for his role in the January 6th attack. What do you think the impact will be of these sentencings following January 6th? Do you think it will really have resonance?
I think accountability and the demonstration of accountability by government for a January 6th insurrection is important. 18 years is no small thing. And we know that since the arrests have begun, over 900 of those involved in the insurrection, the Oath Keepers have basically not been as active as they were. So it shows that accountability is important, that it has an impact on the activity of the groups that are held accountable. But it's not all one size fits all. There's another group called the Proud Boys, who have also been part of the investigation into the insurrection. And they're actually more active. In fact, many of those groups are targeting, for example, the LGBTQ community. But overall, when the country sees that there's accountability for violence, accountability for hate, accountability for trying to undermine our very democracy, I think that sends a really important statement.
And why do you think we are seeing this rise? I mean, the words of Donald Trump, the internet, gun culture. Is there one area you would say that really, is it the economy that sends us into these frequent historic spirals of hate, anti-Semitism, and all other forms of hate?
There's no one reason, but, historically, when you look at pandemics or economic downturns, or, concerns that legitimate people have about their livelihood, people tend to look at others to blame for these challenges. And often that's where hate starts to incubate. The problem is there are individuals, there are groups and movements that actually try to exploit those moments in time. So this rise in hatred and violence that we're seeing in Massachusetts and elsewhere, it's not surprising that it comes off of a pandemic, for example, but there's no one silver bullet to solve it. This is why we need social media to act. We need influencers to act. We need government and everyday people. The one thing everyday people can do is, if you see something that is hateful, you see violence, report it, because that data is going to help us find solutions.
Even those small steps are very important. Thank you, Oren Segal. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
The music industry and fans worldwide are mourning the loss of rock and R&B soul legend Tina Turner, who died Wednesday at 83. Her career spanned generations, 8 Grammy wins, 25 nominations, a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, and not one but 2 inductions into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, once as part of Ike and Tina Turner, and then again recognizing her as a solo artist. And as much as her success, Tina Turner became known for her experience with domestic violence, suffering brutal abuse at the hands of her first husband, Ike Turner, before she was finally able to escape and set out on her own, and later coming out with hits like this one. Joining me to discuss her musical and personal legacies are Danielle Queen D. Scott, the assistant chair of the ensemble department at Berklee College of Music, and a lifelong Tina Turner fan who performed the icon's music when she was a student at Berklee, and Reverend Traci Jackson, the director of the Domestic and Sexual Violence Project for Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts. So, Danielle, let's start with you. What is your personal connection to Tina Turner?
I was such a fan growing up. I was Tina Turner for Halloween. I had the big wig and a sequins dress that my mom bought me, and I inhaled her autobiography before the movie came out. I was really infatuated with her presence on stage, but with her voice, how edgy it was. I used to mimic her to try to get that sound, that strength, that growl, that edginess. It was something I really was inspired by as a young musician.
I saw a description of her voice as screaming dirt, I think it was, which really somehow seems to fit.
Yeah.
But tough to follow. Really,
Absolutely.
Really tough. Reverend Jackson, do you have a personal connection to Tina Turner?
I absolutely do. Much like Danielle, I grew up listening to Tina Turner. My first trip to New York City, which was also my first time on an airplane, my sisters and I were in our hotel room, the Edison Hotel in New York City, jumping up and down in our beds, screaming Proud Mary, dancing to Tina Turner on the radio. I think that if you grew up in that era, you had to have known the song, her music, and just who she was, and how amazing she was.
So Danielle, let's start by talking a little bit more about her music. How would you describe it? She had so many different, really, genres she could move into. She was a masterful interpreter. She did an amazing job with even covering tunes from other artists. So how would you describe what it was about her musical quality?
I think transcendental is the perfect word. She could move from something like Proud Mary to covering Sly and the Family Stone, and then her more electronic sound in the 80s. She just spanned and was a chameleon through all of the decades of music. And she was a rocker, but also soulful. And I think that makes her really unique as an artist, the way that she was able to design her career.
And what do you think was her influence on the generation that we're seeing today, the generation of singers? What is it that they draw from her?
I think her strength on stage, her strength, particularly for women musicians, her strength as a commanding the stage, commanding a band of males, commanding background singers, dancing and moving around the stage, but still having so much versatility with her voice, I think is really inspiring to others. And the generation of musicians that she inspired, like Rolling Stones, I think that all the people who are inspired by them are inspired by Tina Turner, whether they know it or not.
Right. But when she was performing, she was early on certainly covering up a lot of pain. We learned early in the 80s, I guess it was, when she came out and began to talk about domestic violence. And I believe this was a time when we weren't really hearing that much about it publicly. There were not a lot of women talking openly. What can you tell us, Reverend?
Well, unfortunately, Liz, we're still not talking about it, unfortunately, as openly as we should be. But I think that it wasn't uncommon, in her generation for domestic violence not to be discussed. I think we lived under the umbrella of what happens in this house stays in this house. And it was really important to keep things secretive. That if someone were in an abusive marriage, you didn't speak of it. It was deemed a relationship concern and not a public one. And so, unfortunately, she, like many, suffered in silence. But we know that she met Ike when she was very young, 17 to be exact, and he was 8 years older than she was. So it's fair to say that there was a grooming process that took place there, that he recognized her for her talent and gained control over the relationship rather quickly.
Absolutely. And so much so, I read, she was really a commodity for him. He trademarked her name, which is a pretty incredible thing, meaning she could easily have been replaced.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, we say in this work that, no one punches you in the face on a first date. If they did, there'd never be a second one. And so very oftentimes victims and survivors of domestic violence are trying to get back to the place when things were good. They've seen this person when things are good, and they just want to get back to that place, maybe not end the relationship, but make the abuse stop. And I think she, like so many, was in that place. She had a great career. She loved music. She loved him. but she wanted to get back to that place and kept believing that eventually they would.
I wonder if people assume that, or maybe don't realize how much courage it took to do what she did, to break away from this powerful hold, to leave with no money in her pocket, and to reinvent herself. Do you think people still see that as an important legacy now?
I think we see it now. I think it's better understood now, but I think for many years it wasn't something that people paid a particular amount of attention to. And I think now it also speaks to the framework in which we do this work when we try to help those that say, why doesn't she just leave, as opposed to why doesn't he or she stop abusing, right? We never ask that question. We always want to know why the victim isn't leaving. But it speaks to how we victim blame. But what she did was incredibly courageous. She left with nothing, as many victims and survivors do every single day, and start life all over again. And she did that, and was very courageous to talk about her story.
Danielle, can you talk a little bit about her style? Because she was really prepared, almost like a doll, you know, with the long hair and the short skirts. And, you know, some of it reflected Ike Turner's vision of how she was supposed to be, almost tribal in the style, in the movements. How do you interpret that now? It continued to be a part of her success, that type of energy. How do you look at that now?
I think I was just watching the music video for The Best, and how they had her, the image of her legs superimposed with the horse. And I was like, oh, I don't remember that being the connection, the strength of her legs and kind of this animalistic stereotype or trope. I do think that her style continues on. We saw it when she performed with Beyonce, Proud Mary, at one of the Grammy performances. But I think that her legacy of style, of showwomanship, of the strength of being a full performer, a dynamic performer. I think that legacy continues in somebody like a Beyonce, even a Megan Thee Stallion, if we go into hip hop. I think, and I definitely think the strength, like the strength of her body, the iconic legs is still something that is iconic and something that a lot of female artists are striving towards.
And she took ownership of that,
right?
Which really made the difference, I think.
Yeah.
What were some of your favorites? What are some of your favorites? What did you sing? What did you feel so connected to?
Proud Mary, but also my very, very, I think the first song that I really gravitated towards was We Don't Need Another Hero. That was the jam. That was the jam.
That's the Thunderdome song, which has really become an anthem, I think.
And I think her presence in that movie really was my first insight into Afrofuturism, what we call now Afrofuturism. Just the costume and her presence and the song and the music, everything was just so forward-thinking for me as a little black girl watching this black woman on stage or on the film was such a powerful moment for me.
So as a musician, as a vocalist, what can you tell us, the rest of us who can't necessarily sing, what is so special about the quality of her voice and how she shapes a song?
I think it is I know that the term screaming dirt is kind of, I love it, but I don't love it at the same time.
Right.
But there's a earthiness. I think that's what the word I'm looking for. There's an earthiness to her voice, something that is so grounded. For me, it's her gospel influence, but also later on in the 80s, I think it's the spirituality that she had, the strength that she got from that comes through. And that really spoke to me even as a young girl, the spirituality. Even though I never went into Buddhism, it gave me the confidence to ground my art in spiritual practice as well.
And Reverend, she used some of this spirituality as well to come to terms with many things in her life. Is that also an example that you use in your work?
Absolutely. You know, part of what is unique about the project that I have at the Urban League is the inviting of faith leaders to the table as first responders. And so it's bringing them on board because they quite possibly can be the first one someone discloses to. And so while we don't expect them to be expert at everything, we can bring them along board and teach them about red flags and warning signs about domestic violence, and then really how to answer the crisis of faith that victims and survivors are having, as well as how to use their faith, even as Tina did, to ground them and to heal. Because we generally have, most of us experience some kinds of trauma in our lives. And so domestic violence becomes yet another traumatic experience for a victim or survivor. So we want them to be able to tap into the part of themselves that they've used in the past to bring healing and to bring hope. And faith is oftentimes what is used for a victim of faith to overcome and just to have the support of their faith community as part of their healing journey.
So she was certainly seen as a role model. Some called her a feminist hero. I want to play a little bit of sound from an interview she did with Larry King on CNN in 1997, and she was talking about being a feminist hero.
Do you realize that you are a feminist hero in America? Heroine?
I'm beginning to. You see, it wasn't something that I planned. I kind of see it as a gift. Because of the life I lived, it had a meaning. And I think that the meaning was all of what is happening now. I think that if I had not given the story to the world, maybe my life would not be as it is.
Reverend, what do you think women who are suffering abuse draw from that kind of message?
I think it gives them the ability to share their own reality. I think that sometimes one of the greatest challenges of domestic violence is that it's isolating. And so it can leave one believing that they're the only person this is happening to. And so when someone like Tina Turner comes public and says, you know what, regardless of race or age or ethnicity or economic status, this can happen to anyone. It doesn't have anything to do with education. It doesn't have anything to do with any of those things. It can happen to anyone. And so her coming public says to other victims and survivors that they can too, and that they don't have to hide. There's no shame in what they've experienced. The shame is on the abuser and not on the victim or survivor. And I think that's what she said.
Okay, Danielle, very quickly, because we have to wrap it up. What song, for those who may, if you can believe it, not be familiar with Tina Turner's music, and there are many more. River Deep, Mountain High doesn't get enough play, I think, but okay. So, Danielle and Reverend, thank you both for joining me. That's it for tonight. We'll be back next week. Thanks for watching. I'm Liz Neisloss. Good night.